Just a reminder to our Speculating Wildly About Crime listeners, this is for entertainment purposes only and solely the thoughts and opinions of our team. We do invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Welcome to Speculating Wildly About Crime. Today we are bringing you the heart-wrenching and tragic as well as curious case of Kendrick Johnson. You may notice a lot of us today are wearing colors that we may not always wear. So we're all dressed in red and black today. And we're doing that in honor of the victim. A couple of Kendrick's favorite colors were red and black. So we thought that would be a way to honor him. I'm going to take you all on a journey. We're all going to travel back in our minds to 2013. We're going to go to Valdosta, Georgia. It's about 3 hours south of Atlanta. And you could probably throw a baseball at the Florida-Georgia line, basically where it is. And the reason I want to bring that up, this is really the deep South. And so any thoughts that you had about the deep South will probably get revealed at some point today, but I just want to paint the picture of where this was. To cite some of my sources, I listened to a number of different podcasts, but the ones that I got a lot of information from were Strange and Unexplained with Daisy Egan. I also listened to a two-part True Crime Garage episode. And then I also listened to an episode of Crime Junkie. And then there is a documentary called Finding Kendrick Johnson, which I found on Tubi. It's on a bunch of different outlets, but that's a free one that you can go out and watch it. And then, of course, various rabbit holes of its Facebook groups, whole 9 yards. So there's a lot of that's in there as well. Before we actually go into the events of that case, just want to tell you a little bit about Kendrick. Kendrick did live with both of his parents. He had a mother and a father, obviously, and then he was one of, I couldn't find any sources that said how many siblings. I know he had at least 2 siblings, at least a sister and a brother. Don't quote me on exactly how many, but he did have a pretty large family. At the time of his death, he was 17 and he was a sophomore in high school. He was a well-known athlete in his school, so he played basketball, football, and also ran track. Football was definitely his number one thing. A lot of his friends would always say Kendrick's dream was to be a football star, and that was what made his eyes light up, right? Just kind of something to paint the picture a little bit about him. Also was described by many of his friends as well as his family that he was somebody who was super duper polite, somebody that was a little bit quieter than most, and somebody who was really good with numbers. Tragically, he didn't get to live the rest of his life, but it sounded like he had a lot going for him and he would have lived a pretty amazing life. It's really sad that we have to talk about this today, but happy to talk about it to bring some light to it and hopefully get some more attention to it. We'll travel to the day that this happened. We'll start on the day Kendrick was to go to school that day. He took the bus to school. He would take the bus home. That morning or at some point that week, Kendrick and his mother had a conversation about how he was going to go watch a basketball game at school later that night. But she was a little alarmed when he didn't come home on the bus that day because it wasn't really unlike him. But she chalked it up a little bit to, okay, he's 17 years old. Maybe he forgot to tell me something. Hey, I think she grabbed either her mother or her sister, one of the two, and said, let's go search for him. So let's go to a bunch of friends' houses. Let's go to the school a couple different times. Let's make a bunch of phone calls. And so they did this for hours and hours. And eventually she said, hey, all this is to no avail, unfortunately. And so she decided to file a police report. I'm going to give a kudos to the Valdosta Police Department. I'm going to take it back real quick too, but kudos to them is for, she called it in and they immediately were at her house, right? They didn't try to give her this bullshit of he ran away, wait 24 hours. They're at her house that night. Hero, I'm glad y'all did that. However, during the initial investigation or when they were taking her statement, basically, one of the officers was stated, and this is quoted in a couple different places, where he told his mother he's probably just out with some fast-tailed girl, end quote. As quickly as I gave you your kudos, I'm taking them right away because I think that's utter bullshit. This lady's distraught, and now you say this about her son. I wish you would have rather just said he was a runaway. Of course, I was like enraged. I was throwing stuff at the TV when I heard about that and read about that, but they filed a missing person report, and She wakes up the next morning. I didn't even think she got much sleep, but wakes up the next morning and says, he's still not home. And you know what? Maybe he didn't fuck around all night. Maybe he ended up going to school. So let's go to the school because that's the place that if he's going to be anywhere but here, he'd probably be there. She ends up at the school at 8 a.m. and goes to the office and says, hey, I'm trying to locate my son. And they say, okay, why don't you go have a seat in the guidance counselor's office? She's sitting down in the guidance counselor's office. They're having a conversation about it. During that discussion, I think she did find out at that time that he hadn't reported to, I think it was his third and fourth period classes the day before. And then something happened in the midst of their conversation. Guidance counselor gets a phone call and it changes the whole tone of the room. So she could immediately tell something was wrong. And the person on the other end of the phone was talking rather loudly. And she overheard somebody say, we have a body in the gym. I want to take a minute here to tell you a little bit about the school. It's a very big school, and I believe it's also an older school. And so they had a new gym and an old gym. With the remodels, they had this new gym where a lot of the sports would take place and basketball games would take place. And that's important to know because one of the questions I had was, how did nobody notice when a basketball game's going on? But turns out this was all taking place in the old gym. And it wasn't like the old gym was abandoned. They would still hold some classes in there. Kids would go through there to get from one end of the school to the other. So it constantly was people in there. The gym has all of these, we'll call them mats. They're sometimes used for wrestling, they're sometimes used for cheerleading. It was never officially stated what these mats were used for, but these are huge mats. I want to say they're about 6 feet tall. They weigh about 180 pounds and they're rolled up when they're not being used. Now, typically they're rolled up and they're laying horizontally. This day, however, because it was 2 days after they had come back from winter break, all the mats were standing vertically. They're all standing in the corner of a gym, and it's, I want to say, 3 or 4 rows of them that are standing back there. And kids being kids, they would climb up on top of them. I'm going to sit up on here and I'm going to be cool while I'm sitting up here and paying attention to the teacher, right? A girl's sitting up on the top of these mats and she notices something out of the corner of her eye and she said, that looks really weird. It looks like a foot. She calls some of her friends over. She immediately screams. They look in there. Holy shit, it is really a foot. So there is I believe it was an athletic director or some sort of teacher that was in the gym that morning. He, with the help of some students, gets the mat down, puts it down, starts to unroll it. And unfortunately, they found the body of Kendrick Johnson in there. When he unrolled the mat, his body was covered in blood, his body was covered in vomit, and nobody even had to tell Jackie. She just knew that was her son. Moments later, or I should say within a half hour, I'll say, police and EMS arrived on scene. They were quickly able to identify the body as 17-year-old Kendrick Johnson. One thing I do want to note about this is, and I'll bring this back up a little bit later, but the police identified his body. However, his sister was at school that day. They didn't ask her to do any kind of identifying or even ask if she wanted to. His mom was at the school at the time. His dad was unfortunately out of town. None of the family members were asked to identify him. It was just done by whatever school officials were in the gym at the time. But his sister did state that they didn't ask me to go look at his body, but they did bring me a shoe and asked me if that was Kendrick's shoe. And I said yes. And that's how they verified it, quote unquote, verified it. Now we have this unfortunate scene where we have this poor child who is found dead in a mat. That leads us to a ton of questions. How did he die? Why was he in the mat? How did he get in there? Was this an accident? Was it intentional? Was there foul play? So we'll start with, why was he even anywhere near the mat in the first place? This being an old school and also in a not very rich part of Georgia, I guess I'll say, kids had to pay for lockers. And so a lot of children either chose not to or didn't have the means to pay for those lockers. And so many kids would store their gym materials, whether it be gym clothes, gym shoes, whatever, they'd store them under these mats. Now, typically, like I mentioned before, they're laying horizontally. So it's, I shouldn't say very easy, but it's a lot easier than if it were vertical to pick up the mat, grab your shoes, go to your gym class, go about your day. And so Kendrick was known to be one of these kids who, and actually even shared a pair of shoes with another boy, which I don't know how their financial situation was, but it just makes me feel like maybe not great. So they shared gym shoes and they also knew that it was under this certain mat. So that's why Kendrick was there. So it is said that what the idea was is that he went into the gym, said, "Hey, I got to get my stuff for gym class. Oh shit, these mats are now up this way. I'm almost 6 feet tall. I believe he was 5'10". I can probably just go down there and get them. I'm just going to dive into this mat and go down there and get my shoes," type of thing. So when the FBI came on site after their initial investigation, that's essentially what they said, was that he must have dove in there and this was an unfortunate accident. And basically sparing you any of the details, they said that he had died by positional asphyxiation, which essentially means that he couldn't breathe and eventually suffocated in there. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation did an autopsy on May 5th, and that autopsy said that there was no blunt force trauma, no significant injuries, and again, that the official cause of death was positional asphyxiation. So everybody wanted to lock this up and say, hey, this was an unfortunate tragic accident. Here's what happened. However, there were a couple things that were just not sitting right. A couple things about the scene and a couple things around his body and the initial autopsy, I should say. Spoiler alert, there's going to be more than one. Number one is there was some blood found on a nearby wall. The police initially tested it and said, it's not Kendrick's, so it must not be part of this case. Goodbye. Who knows? It was probably there for years, is what they said. There was also a pair of shoes that was found nearby, as well as a hoodie that was found within the vicinity that were never initially tagged and bagged as evidence. Again, a little suspect when you got this thing going on. There were also the shoes that he was diving for were supposedly underneath the mat and inches from his head. And these shoes were black and white shoes. So they were all black shoe with white trim around and maybe even had some white within the black. These shoes were clean. There was no blood found on these shoes. So it was really eerie or really odd to me to say, hey, I have this kid who's upside down in this mat. He has vomit, he has blood, but here's this clean shoe that's inches away from him. Interesting. Another thing that was interesting was when Kendrick's body was found, he did not have shoes on his feet. He only had socks, and I think even one of the socks was starting to come off. And his shoes that he was wearing for that day, so his normal shoes, were found in the mat tucked behind his knees, or in between, behind his legs, between his knee and his ankle, basically. So again, weird. I don't know how your shoes would end up in that position as you're diving in. I guess not impossible, but just weird. Another weird thing, and I'll explain this away, but it did seem weird. In the state of Georgia, it's stated that the coroner is supposed to arrive on the scene within minutes of a dead body being discovered. This coroner did not go onto the scene until several hours later. Now, upon listening to some podcasts and upon digging into some things, it was one of those unwritten rules where like, hey, yeah, this is what's supposed to happen. However, a lot of times when the coroners do arrive on the scene right away, they have to sit back and not do much because police have to do their investigation. So they're not really doing anything until a couple hours later anyways. So it wasn't uncommon. However, it was still against the law, right? Again, I think they lose some integrity with that. By the time the coroner did arrive, obviously the scene had been super compromised. Law enforcement was everywhere. Nobody was handling anything with any integrity. The sealed body bag was opened and closed and open and closed. It was a hot mess, right? Nothing was done the correct way. It was also a little bit weird that they really only shut down the gym. They didn't put the school on any kind of lockdown. Now, I did hear some conflicting reports. Some said, oh, the school was on a lockdown for a couple hours. Some said, hey, classes were just resuming as normal. So I can't really quite say, but it sounded like the kids were still milling and going about their day. Another thing, and I think I talk about this a little bit later too, but the parents showed up on site, did put in their initial report that Kendrick did have bruising on his jaw, I believe the left side of his jaw. And so it was really weird that was never taken into consideration and it was just automatically deemed an accident. And then one of the kickers was, so Kendrick's father was out of town at the time that this discovery was made. And he demanded when he came back into town a few days later that I want to identify his body. And so he went to the morgue. And I don't know much about a morgue. Have any of y'all been in a morgue ever? Yes, no, maybe. Okay, we're all okay.
Nope.
Good. But supposedly, and it would make sense, a morgue is supposed to be very cold because you want to preserve the body as much as you possibly can. But Kendrick's father stated that when he went to go identify KJ, which is what they called Kendrick for short, he went and identified KJ's body, and there was no cold air. In fact, a whoosh of hot air came out as his body was shown to him for identification. This leaves Kendrick's family super upset. So they start having protests. They start getting in the process of filing some lawsuits against the school, against the state, all of these things. And eventually they did do one protest where they would constantly go from block to block and do these protests, usually pretty silently. And I shouldn't say silently, but usually pretty peaceful is what I should say. But they just kept finding that it wasn't really getting the attention that they wanted. So at one point, they went to a law enforcement building and basically armed together and barricaded themselves in front of the entrance. Eventually, KJ's parents were both arrested that day, which technically they were breaking the law, so fine. But that was the jumpstart that they needed to try and bring some attention to this case. While it was sad, it was still a good thing that happened. And the person that was doing the second autopsy had some doubts about the positional asphyxiation. And the reason he did was because I guess when you're upside down and you would die from positional asphyxiation, but it would make your lungs heavy because essentially your lungs are going to drown you out and you won't be able to breathe, is how I was understanding it. Come from me if I'm understanding it wrong. I'm not a doctor. But when the person doing this next autopsy was examining his body, he didn't see that his lungs were any heavier. So he thought that was weird. So he went through and did his entire autopsy, and his report came back as an unexplained, apparent, non-accidental blunt force trauma was the cause of death. He also stated that this would have been consistent with the initial EMS report or EMT report that came the day that they came and examined Kendrick from the day that he was found. Another weird thing about this autopsy that I'll bring up is when this person went to go do this autopsy, it was found that nearly all of Kendrick's organs were missing and his entire body cavity was filled with newspaper. Now, during an autopsy, you do take out the organs, and if it's going to be part of an investigation, you keep the organs elsewhere because you may have to examine certain organs to look at cause of death, to look at what damage was done. But however, in this case, they deemed the organs not suitable for donation. And so it sounded like they were disposed of because of that. And I guess I found conflicting reports. I found a lot of reports that said, hey, this is really weird. But then I also found a lot of reports that said, hey, this is standard practice. When we have organs that are not suitable for donation, we just dispose of them. And then the body is an empty cavity, essentially.
So the newspaper, is that a normal thing?
However, nowadays, I think they end up filling the body with some kind of cotton, is what I heard.
So it's not
Um,
against the law. It used to be normal practice for funeral homes to do this.
We'll say normal. Like I found conflicting reports, but it wasn't unheard of, we'll say.
I understood it, and I definitely could be wrong, but I understood it as in a long time ago, it was a normal practice. It has never been illegal to do. It just became something that people just didn't do anymore unless you had to, depending the trauma the body took. But this funeral home heard the story and said, we will do this for your family for free because of the tragedy. And so could they have been cutting corners just to save some money since they're gifting this to the family?
Yeah, that was said, and that came up in a lot of things that I read too, where it's, hey, we're not going to put all the bells and whistles on this because we're doing it for free type of thing. Maybe some steps got missed because this is maybe a good point to bring this up too. But the person that did the second autopsy, not only did he not have any of the organs and the body was filled with newspaper, it was also a nude body, and Kendrick's clothes just went missing that day. They were somehow going from the initial autopsy, so went to the autopsy with clothes on, got to the funeral home nude. When the second autopsy was done, hey, where are his clothes? And there are signage logs that I believe the funeral home did sign off that, yes, we have his clothes. So you would think, oh, are they liable? But again, to David's point, were we cutting corners and were we just saying, yeah, we have all this stuff and not really double checking it? Because I think we're all guilty of probably if we have a checklist at work or we have a checklist at school, we just check it off and we don't always necessarily check and make sure that every single thing is done or there, right?
I'm assuming that means there wasn't a service or.
No, there was a service. The funeral home also did the service for him. The family brought clothes and did all of that for him, right? They made it right. But yeah, there was a service.
He should have still been in a suit when he
But the
got.
second autopsy, I believe, wasn't done until June. So this was well after his service would have been.
But he still would have been in his suit.
I don't know. I don't know. For lack of better words, I don't know what happens to a body. I like to think, I imagine that my loved one gets buried with whatever they're with, but if it's potentially part of an investigation, do they?
I would think so because it would be new things. They're not going to bury you in the
Right.
crime
The clothes
scene.
he died in.
And so what I understood about the timeline with the one autopsy, second autopsy, is it didn't happen back to back. It
was like
one autopsy was
a couple
done,
months.
the services happened, the service happened, and then later on is when they were like, oh, let's revisit. Am I wrong with that, to think that?
No, you're right.
So somewhere between them recovering the body after the service for the second autopsy, they disclosed him and shipped him off without clothes.
So if I think about your funeral service, then you go to the grave site.
So let me back this up. Let me maybe re-explain this because I think maybe I didn't say it correctly or it didn't come out correctly. I believe what happened was Kendrick was clothed when his body was found at the school. He was taken to the place to have an autopsy, still clothed. He then goes to the funeral home, should have been in said clothes. However, funeral home, second autopsy, both state there was never closed. And the only reason it came up with the second autopsy is because not that's when they discovered that he didn't have clothes, so that's where I maybe explained it wrong. But that was just another thing to say, hey, here's something fishy that's going on, right? Because he essentially came to the funeral home nude. And so he was like, hey, I want to have the clothes that came with his body. And they said, cool, but he came nude, so I don't know where they are.
Would the police have collected them as evidence, assuming that it might have been a crime originally?
You could put a pin in, could the police have collected them and stop your sentence there?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Because I don't know that, because what we're going to talk about, and I didn't mean for that to sound like rude, but what we're going to talk about later is in true Jamie fashion, I think there may have been some police, there's some things going on that maybe the police weren't.
Can I ask a question about timeline while we're talking about that, Jamie?
Yeah.
You had mentioned that he was missing from like his third or fourth period classes, and I have two questions about this. First, I don't have kids, so maybe somebody that does can speak to this. But if you're there at the beginning of the day and then halfway through the day you're not in classes anymore, and maybe they don't do this for high school, but do they take attendance and send out notifications of, hey, your kid isn't in class anymore?
I'd mentioned we're not in the richest part of Georgia, right? So they may or may not have. I don't know how good the school system was.
When I would get calls from school, from my kids, high school, I wouldn't get it till 6 o'clock at night.
I was just
So
gonna
you
say,
originally, when they
Wow.
Yes. And then at that time,
Yeah.
she was like, oh, yeah, no shit. He didn't come home from the bus.
You don't know right away. It's literally like later that day that you get a call. So it's not immediately.
Okay,
And
and
I know that's just
my second question, Jamie, is do we know what period he had gym class?
I want to say it was third period because that was the first period that he didn't show up for. And we'll talk about surveillance cameras in a little bit, but he is seen going into the old gym. That's the last image that we see of him, presumably to go get his shoes to go to gym class.
Okay. So I'm just trying to picture this. So it sounds like he left his shoes in a mat that was horizontal, right?
Correct.
And then when they put it straight, they just, everything just fell to the bottom.
I didn't read anything that spelled out what happened with it. My thought was maybe this happened is they were cleaning the schools during winter break. They had to move the mats to clean the floor. And maybe they knew this was a known thing. Like Kendrick and this guy weren't the only ones who hid their shit in the mats. So I'm wondering if they took and said, hey, this shit went with this mat. When we put it upright, let's make sure that these things go with this. Maybe. I don't know for sure.
Got it. So would my thinking is it would be easier just to get them from the bottom.
But I think they were super heavy.
There was 21 of them, and they were in the furthest one. So they would have to literally move 200-pound, 20 mats to get to it.
This is a picture of the mat. So imagine there's 21 of them standing up like this. I don't know how heavy these are. They look pretty heavy. Maybe you could pick them up, but I don't know if it would only pick up this much of it. And what if your shoe was all the way over here in the middle? Would you be able to pick it up all the way? Or maybe he thought it was easier, hey, I'm just going to dive down. Or maybe he was just being a kid and saying, fuck it, I'm going to be goofy and go in here.
David, you said he was in the furthest one to the wall?
This isn't an exact picture, I don't think, but actually it is because here's the shoe that I talked about. But yeah, he was way back there. He wasn't in the front one.
So how did he even?
We can climb up on here because that's how his body was discovered. There's bleachers right here. So
Here's
you
what
could go
Ah,
here, jump
Right on
up.
top of them.
Got it.
And if you'll remember, Jamie had mentioned how when they were finding blood on the wall, if he was in that very first one and the wall's 6 deep, there wouldn't be blood on it. So that was another sign for me to realize that he was close to that wall, right? Because the kids would jump up and just sit on those. shoes.
Mhm.
Got it.
I kind of wish we had a picture of the top of them, like what it looks like because from the side,
Right, because there's no way if they're tied up like that. Like,
So this width is stated to be 19 inches wide, and the width of Kendrick's shoulders, with as wide as they would be 14 inches wide. So it would be hard to go in there.
with the shoes. I'm-
This is crazy, is it not?
I'm having issues right now with
that
this. I
doesn't
don't.
make any.
How are your shoes going to end up like that?
Yeah, even if you kicked them off, I guess in a perfect crazy scenario, which is maybe what some people are claiming this whole thing is, yeah, sure, maybe if I kicked them, it's like that one trick shot that you make. Maybe if I kicked them off exactly right, they'd land that way. Maybe.
It's no.
I have so many questions.
But
Me
wait,
too.
wasn't there two pair of shoes, like the ones that he was going after for a sport and the ones that he was currently wearing?
Yeah.
So is that one right there? That one that's showing in that picture would make me think it's the one that he's wearing. And when he's fighting to get out, he kicks that one off. That's not the shoe he was going after.
Correct.
So
Yep, these are the
why-
shoes he was
so
wearing
that's
for the
why-
day that he kicked off. Yep.
I still don't. How do they land like that? That doesn't.
But so I have questions.
Yeah, let's stop and let's do questions.
We're
I'm down.
talking about how does this land like this? How was his body bruised? How was he laying this way? And correct me if I'm wrong, but if there are 21 of these things and he's in the furthest one and they're having to move them around because someone spots his body and they're having to lay it down and unroll it to find him, isn't that going to cause disturbance of the body and the shit in it and cause bruises? And not to mention he's been upside down for 24 hours or however long it's been, which means blood's rushing to your head, which is going to cause discoloration on top of lack of oxygen. I've not heard anybody talk about that. They talked as if he had perfectly just laid down in this and died, and everything that happened was before he got in that, when I don't see that being the case. You're going to be fight or flight. I think part of what was making him throw up, part of what was making him probably pass, is the fact that he is a young athletic kid. He's got energy and he's fight or flight and he's wiggling and he's squirming to get out. And so that's going to cause disturbance to things on top of lack of oxygen and blood flow. And then by the time they lay the cot down and start unrolling it to find him, the shoe's going to be in a different place. I'm willing to bet you that shoe, like, how do we not know that when they laid it down when they discovered his body and they laid it down, they didn't pick the shoe up and put it right back in that place to take the picture of this shoe was found. We don't know where it was found, but it was obviously somewhere around here. So we're just going to lay it here by his foot. And then now this is what we're speculating on when it has nothing to do with it.
Jamie, do you know where the blood came from on his body?
They just assumed it was from him because he
But,
was
like,
upside down for so
where-
long that it flowed. They're saying gravity. And I debated showing the picture of him and not showing the picture of him, but his family made a big deal about showing the picture of his face and how swollen it was, and that's where the blood came from. But to be honest, I truly feel that came from being upside down for so long and your blood rushing and it's going to swell, right? So they assume that's where all the blood came from.
I still have so many questions. I just don't know. I don't even know where to start.
David, you're thinking that the bruise came from when he was fighting to get out of the mat? The bruise on his cheek?
Possibly. I don't feel like that has been discussed as an option. I think the reason he kept getting lower and lower in that is because he was so strong. He was able to maneuver it and loosen it up a little bit.
And a mat isn't a hard surface, so there's give to it as well.
Right. It's malleable. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
I had an idea. What if the shoes were placed on top? What if he was we're going to go there for a minute, even though I don't quite believe it. What if he does dive into that, but he puts the shoes on top of the mat, just as I'm going to put them there and they fall that way? Because that
Yeah.
would be the only, and then they just get stuck because they're
As
there.
he's like struggling.
Yeah, as he's like moving around, that's how they end up in there.
So my thought was, so even though it's not a hard surface, we talked about how heavy it was. So if that's 200 pounds, even when they laid it down to get him out, he's in the middle of it. So that's at least 100 pounds on your body.
And I don't know if a soft, malleable surface like that could cause blunt force trauma. Would it be strong enough to? I do want to go back to that second autopsy for a second with this kind of theory that you're putting out there. He reported it was unexplained, apparent, non-accidental blunt force trauma that would not have been caused by Kendrick, but had to be from another source.
But do you think so this tube is up and Janelle said they got to tip it over to get him out. Then they got to move it because it might not be just in the right spot to untie and unroll. Like maybe just that was a blunt force enough while they're trying to get him out. Maybe that did it.
I'm gonna say, and I'm not an expert, of course, but you cannot bruise after death. Like you can't really bleed after death because it's after death. Yeah, it just doesn't happen. There's no blood flow anymore.
That was
Good point.
I was learning for the day. Bye guys.
But can blood not ooze? Because unfortunately, when placed in such pressures, you can bleed out of the eyes, nose, ears. There are
as you're dying, but not
after death.
Yes, once your heart stops pumping, you can't. There's no longer blood flow going, and the same with bruising. Any bruising has to happen before you die or in that moment, not afterwards. You cannot bruise.
Could that be why he was so swollen though? Was all
That's
that
100
blood was right there causing all that pressure and it had nowhere to go?
That would make sense, yeah. But the bruise itself happening after death does not make sense.
So they also had the GBI, which is the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. They also want to say I heard this, but I think they had to call in somebody from DC because there was a conflict of interest, which we're going to get into in a second, where it couldn't be the FBI from that town.
Oh,
Do you
I don't know if I
remember
read
that?
I don't know.
I want to say that they brought in law enforcement from a different state.
But still, bringing in the law enforcement isn't going to change anything because were they brought in before the body was ever moved? Like from the school?
No.
Things already have happened before these experts actually got there. What happened between the discovery of the body and the experts coming in? I think those things play a factor in it.
Yeah, because unfortunately, like outside sources are not going to be the first people
True.
responding.
Yeah.
Which can I go back to the picture for 1 second, Jamie? Is this after they flip it down? Who took this photo? Is this a police photo?
I don't know for sure. This wasn't
Okay.
like from an original police investigation. This is a photo that's talked about in almost every single podcast, though.
Okay.
I think they lead you to believe that this is how he was found, but with the way that things weren't done by the book with discovering his body, it could very well be that this is after it was already taken down. And you got to remember that they initially unrolled the mat and then rolled it back up.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
For them to identify KJ, it's going to have to be unrolled. Did they unroll it and they're like, oh shit, this is KJ, there's shoes everywhere, there's blood and vomit. But then the police get there and they're like, how did you find it? And they're like, oh, it was rolled up. And they're like, okay, we shouldn't touch the crime scene. Let's roll it up. Let's put the shoe back in here with it just to show that the shoe's with the body and take the pictures. I do not think this is how this kid was found. And I think this is what is leading this poor family into thinking things that probably are not true.
That's mind-blowing. You're right.
I'm struggling with that because I think if it's not the police, obviously the police just weren't at the school and found him. It was somebody at the school that
found him. And
your immediate you're not going to know who it is. You're not going to know if that person's alive immediately or has passed.
But you're
I
also not
think
gonna
your
call,
median
you're gonna
role-
call the police and just wait and see for, you know, wait for them to show up before
We
you.
do CPR. Can we? How long have they been in there? Are they still alive? Can I resuscitate?
I
Yep.
think it was pretty apparent that he was not living when they unrolled the mat, unfortunately.
when they unroll it, but
But when they look down, they just see a
Sure.
foot.
whoever found him in that position, I don't think would be able to immediately tell. I think they probably would have unrolled it, but then obviously there's a photograph of him rolled up in that mat.
Because I'm sorry, if I was in that position, if I saw a foot sticking out of a mat, I'm knocking that mat over and I'm going to see if I can resuscitate, especially if it's a kid. Because some of them talk about there was a smell, but how much of a smell was there? Because the kids were climbing up on the mat and sitting there before they. So it's not like you walked in the gym and saw it. So did the smell kind of happen as it was as they were unrolling the mat, exposing that air, and that's when they found the vomit? Because you're not going to see the vomit if you're looking and his feet are sticking up. The vomit's down on the ground somewhere. So they knew there was vomit. They knew there was blood. They knew there was all these things, and there was this smell. Like the timelines with this is just not adding up to me. I don't think there's a murder being covered up. I think there is lack of an experience and fear of not knowing how to handle situations being covered up.
So let's talk about some of the things though. So obviously the other side of this is the other big speculation is that there was a murder being covered up, right? So his parents eventually ended up filing a wrongful death suit in January of 2015. They were claiming that he actually died to being beaten by some fellow students and that it was actually a homicide. So I want to point out a couple of things that lead people to some of these suspicions. One thing I want to talk about is the surveillance video. The school had, I want to say 62 or 64 cameras. And in October of 2013, a judge ordered the release of the surveillance video. However, they gave the school the right to release the surveillance video. The school got to decide what pieces of the video they were going to release, what pieces they weren't going to release. It took them 5 days to get the footage to investigators. And by the time they got the footage, there was timestamps that were all over the place, that were jumping all over the place. There were pieces that were missing all over the place. It was said that some cameras should have been rolling, but they weren't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some of this is explained away because a lot of the cameras they had were motion censored, right? We're not going to have a camera going all day long. It's just going to come and go as people are walking by it. But it is a little suspect, and it goes back to your HR comment, David, of the school is responsible for what's being released because, of course, we don't want our enrollment to go down now that there's this dead body. How can we make this as pretty as possible? We're just going to give you these pieces. Where, in my opinion, what should have happened is the GBI should have said, we need all the tapes from that day and we need them right now. We don't want you to take 5 days to figure out what you want to send to us because who knows what could happen.
You're thinking that they were obviously edited before.
I think there was things that they didn't show them. Yeah, or and it could have been as simple as we didn't show this hallway because it didn't matter to the crime and to the investigation of this going into a homicide. But the school, nobody in that school is law enforcement except for maybe if they had a liaison officer. You don't have the right to decide what's evidence and what's not evidence.
So if you're thinking this, then clearly the authorities are also questioning this.
Authorities or Kendrick's family, I think, questioned a lot of this, is where a lot of this speculation is going to come from, to be honest. So that was one thing. The Kendrick's parents eventually, for many years, they kept saying he was beaten by fellow students. Eventually in 2015, they started naming these students, and that's when they came out with this whole campaign of, here's my son's face. How could he possibly been an accident? This is clearly somebody who murdered him. And they specifically named the Bell brothers. So it was Brian and Brandon Bell, who both went to the high school where Kendrick went. Brian and Kendrick actually were on a football team together, and there was a altercation that took place between them on a football bus coming home from a game or going to a game, where they got into a big fight about over a girl. It seemed, I don't know if there's speculation that a girl liked KJ or he slept with this girl, and it was actually somebody that Brandon liked, or Brian, I'm sorry, this was Brian. And anyways, they got in a big fight, and it was witnessed by everybody on the bus. Two things were said to happen after this fight. One is that Brian's brother Brandon was telling students around the school that this fight isn't over yet. And let me make a note. Brandon and Brian's father, his name was Rick Bell. He was an FBI agent. And it was brought up by a witness of some sort that Rick Bell ran into KJ one day at school and said, that fight on the bus wasn't a fair fight. We should have you come over to my house and then you can fight Brian again for real. Oh, and this is where the DC thing comes into place. So his father was a former FBI agent. He instructed the brothers, don't do any interviews, don't do this, don't do that. And because of this, there was a homicide investigative unit that came from DC that was called in because they wanted an unbiased source to come in and try to do this investigation. Even though that was happening, there is rumors to be said that Rick Bell was doing his own investigations with people. He was having his own conversations with people at the school, with people in law enforcement, with students. And it was rumored that some of these people came forward and said, I felt very threatened by Rick. Again, rumors are rumors, but there's always some truth in a lie, right? I also found it really weird that the Bell's family claimed that KJ and Brian were these great friends. They got along. Everything was cool between them. But he didn't show up at his funeral. And KJ's parents said they weren't friends. They weren't like that. They were on the team together. They knew each other. They weren't like besties going to the movies. They're fighting over fucking a girl, which again, I guess you do that in high school. We all have boy drama, girl drama in high school, and it probably escalated to fights sometimes. Hopefully it didn't escalate to murder though. So their statement essentially states that this is how the homicide happened, is that Kendrick was lured into the gym by a girl, and that when he got into the gym, the brothers were there with another male, and they took a dumbbell or a weight of some sort, hit him over the head. He immediately fell to the ground. They stuffed him in the mat to cover it up and went about their days.
How the logistics of that though? If it's something that's either taller than me or as tall as me,
We
how?
got 3 football players. It didn't take much for them to get the mat down.
But it was in the furthest mat.
Yeah, you'd pick the closest one.
If you're trying to hide it, you'd pick the furthest one away.
Right.
Yeah, that would make more
You
sense.
got to be quick though, too, right? So if you did that, you have to quickly hide the body. So to get it to the farthest mat would take time.
I guess if somebody is already up there, so you have one person pulling and one person lifting from the ground, and then you could just drag him to the last one. But still, it just,
Wouldn't you be bleeding though if you were hit with a dumbbell? That would cause your bleeding, but
Yeah.
then you'd bleed all over the outside of a mat or the gym floor.
if it's, I would assume if it's something hard enough to kill you from blunt force trauma,
Yeah.
I would assume there would be,
there'd be
yeah.
blood, for
The
sure.
thing is just a little too perfect for me. Like, how did they get his body that
Because these mats are 6
perfectly
feet
in
tall,
there?
right? And I don't care if you have 3 football players, you also have another dead or at least knocked out football player that is dead weight.
Yeah.
And so they're going to have to pick up this dead weight person, put them on a 6 foot high something. Then they're going to have to throw a shoe down and wedge his body with his arms and shoulders in a certain way, wedge his body into this hole.
No, they wouldn't have to wedge his body because they could have had the mat unrolled and put his
Roll
body
up the
in
mat.
it and then rolled it up and then put it up.
But
And
that's
then-
a lot of
and then-
rearranging.
It depends on how tight they are pushed in together. If they're just like a mat has some room here between this other mat, it might not be.
I doubt they're going to put them perfectly an inch apart. They stacked them there for a reason. But even yet, you're in a school with 800 plus people, and you've had time to lay out this mat, roll this kid up after knocking him out, and stack them all back perfectly for people to come into a gym class to
But
gather.
we don't know when they did it.
We don't, because what if, let me just throw this out there.
I'm gonna
What-
go right with you right here. Yeah.
What if they lured him in, they quickly killed him around this 1:30 p.m. time frame in a different room, said, okay, shove his body into this place or whatever, and then came back after school, maybe even when the basketball game was going on and everybody else is on the other end of the school in the gym, in the other gym, and came back and said, okay, now we have to get this shit together. And what if, and I'm just speculating,
Mhm.
what if Rick even came with them and he's an FBI agent, so he's going to show them exactly how to.
But that's including now that's what, 3 football players, an FBI agent dad, and this alleged girl luring him in. And that's a lot of people to be like,
To keep
okay,
a
now everybody
secret.
shut your mouth.
It could be more simple than that. Honestly, we don't know when at all when he died. We don't have a time frame or when he died or when, or even if he was like hit and then hidden for a bit and then who knows
All we know is
I'm
it
sure
was
we'll
the
get there,
day
but-
before, right?
before
We
they were.
know
Yeah.
he was last seen on camera at 1:09 p.m. and we know that he was discovered the next morning in the mat at 8 a.m.
So there's time to hide that. If you do school sports, if you're playing football, if you have football practice or any kind of practice after school, you're there for a bunch of hours.
Mhm.
So kids and maybe not teachers, but people are still there in the school after school's done. I know that from having a child in high school, there are people still there until who knows later at night. It could be done.
I love that this whole experience gives me the opportunity to say sentences I never thought I would say in my life. But I need to ask questions about the vomit. It was in the map, which means that he was alive.
Like,
So that was a question I initially had, was how could he have been murdered if there was vomit found in there? Because you have to be alive to have vomit come up, right? But I did go back and think, like, how could it be the other way? Roll him up in the mat, and they didn't give a fuck about him if this is what happened, right? And he's maybe knocked unconscious and they think he's dead and they roll him up in there. When he comes to or his body figures out what's going on, at that point he could vomit.
think of, I'm sorry, but think of when you're drunk. If you're so fucked up and you're not conscious of what's going on, but you could still vomit and choke on your own vomit. Or even if you're fucked up on some sort of drug, you can still vomit that's just your body's natural reaction. You're not quite dead yet. It's your body's natural reaction to whatever is going on, and you could choke on your own vomit.
And
Especially
So
you
I-
being
made a
upside
comment
down.
earlier that you don't
Yeah.
necessarily have. He didn't necessarily have to be dead when they put him
Yeah.
in.
I think that's where I would lean. I would think that they put him in the mat thinking he was dead, or just hit him unconscious and knew he wasn't dead and then still put him in the mat. And then that was where the vomit and the blood and all that shit came from.
We were talking a little bit about how the dad was doing his own interviews and all of these things, right? During this whole time, KJ's family was bringing the wrongful death. They were trying to get a homicide investigation going. Maybe it's coincidental, maybe it's not, but KJ's family attorney resigned from the case before it was even tried. Maybe it was because he didn't think he could win. Maybe it's because he was threatened. There was also 7, not 1, not 2, not 3, 7 judges who they basically stated there's not enough evidence to prove that he was murdered, so it was never a criminal case. So let's just plant that in your head. Another thing that was, and I want to paint the picture of this. So this was said in the documentary, and the documentary was very much from the perspective of KJ's parents, much like Making a Murderer came from the perspective of Stephen Avery. So look at it with this. But in that documentary, it was stated that the Department of Justice at one point told KJ's family, we know the shoes were planted there. We just don't have enough evidence to prove it. So it was like all of these cases that we talk about all the time where the cops know more than we know, but they can't come out and publicly say something. Or so it was stated to sway you that way.
I think David was like head on with his suggestion that he was found differently than what we believe.
Probably, but we'll never know.
Jamie, when the documentary said planted, was it actually planted or was it placed? Was it placed there for photographic reasons or was it planted there for cover-up reasons?
Yeah, and again, this documentary is very much in the light of KJ and his family and being a murderer, so I think that's why the word planted was used, to lead you down that path. Absolutely. To think that it was all cover up, and that's where a lot of these things with the school videotape, the dad questioning all these people, the 7 judges recused, they're all trying to lead you to this was a big cover up, right?
But could one small town FBI person change 7 judges and another person to quit and retire and forbid? Do you have that much power? Because if so, then I need an application.
It's not the same thing, but Trump was able to get a bunch of crazies to storm the federal building, right? When you're in power.
Some of these judges had to come from outside areas, right?
If he was, let's say, hit in the head with a dumbbell, in my perspective, that's going to leave a pretty decent mark or gash or something on your face or head. And let's just, for the sake of argument, say that first medical examiner wasn't trying to cover something up. Let's just go down that path. How could he miss a huge gash on somebody's head?
No, he didn't. The first EMS or EMT, I forget what the code or the word that they used, they said that he had bruising on his jaw.
Yeah, but the first autopsy said there wasn't any blunt force trauma.
Yeah, because the bruise on a jaw is different.
He was paid.
I kind of figure
if we're going down that road of he was paid, then we have to go down the route of the first autopsy was paid off, the 7 judges were paid off, the cops. If that's the road we're going to go down, we have to assume that it's 100% a cover up and not the school was neglectful and the cops didn't really know what they were like. I feel like in this case,
that is the speculation that it is 100% a cover up and he manipulated all these people. It's a speculation.
I'm not on this train with you, Jamie.
But okay, but it doesn't all have to be monetary though. What if he has dirt on you? Or what if he could take your job away? He doesn't have to shell out millions of dollars.
Does he donate money to the school?
I'm assuming this is a public school. So it's
but they could get funding from anonymous resources.
Oh,
I think if anything,
never mind.
I feel like it may have been an accident. Kendrick might have been going for his shoes and then it could have just happened. Or if you think there's any part of murder, conspiracy or whatever, maybe he was doing that. He was like, his legs are sticking out and he's kicking. And then people said, oh, this is a really good time to play a prank on him and stuff him in there and then just left him there. Or we're actually trying to murder him and just left him in there.
I keep thinking about the Elisa Lam of it all. She had a very small space. She had no signs of a struggle, no injury. I would assume that would be impossible if somebody was forcing her in there.
So he would have had to go in there as a diving.
And he would have kind of wiggle, right, to get in.
If you're forcing somebody, how do you force their arm? I'm sorry.
You don't. You're positioning them. I'm going back to, and we still have a couple things to talk about, but I'm going back to, they knocked him out and either they kept his body somewhere until they could put it in there. Either way, I think that's what they did.
Were
Whether he
his
was alive
arms-
or not, they can position you however you want when you're passed out.
See, I don't think high schoolers
Drop
can
him
think that way.
in there. So
Now I need to know where his arms were.
his arms were up.
I thought it was one up, one down.
That's why I think he
Tall, and
was
he's
doing.
5'10", with his arms
Yeah.
at his side, so he's even taller with his arms above his head.
The
So wouldn't
only
he be
way
taller
I
than the
can see
mats?
this-
Oh yeah.
That's why they could
true, Dana.
see his feet sticking out from the top.
The only reason I ask, because if you're gonna dive, you're gonna go this way. You're gonna go with both your arms. You're not gonna do this.
Unless you're trying to
that.
hold on to the top of the mat with your other arm
Mm.
as you're
It's
leaning.
none of that. I'm sorry, but I get it. You're 17. You might not be 100% smart about what you're about to do. But
No.
what part of you would say, I'm just gonna dive into this 6-foot mat and grab my shoe at the bottom? Yeah, none of that makes any sense to me.
Absolutely, it doesn't. But how many kids have gotten their head stuck between stair rails?
And they're not going to measure the mat, right? Like he probably stood next to it with his hand up and went, "Oh yeah, I can reach the top." So then he
Here's
went
the thing,
diving in.
Granted,
But why
if-
wouldn't you
if we
just
look
knock
at-
the mat over and grab your shoes?
Or you'd think he would have knocked the mat
Try to
over
lift-
getting in.
Try to lift it up and grab your shoe underneath. Like that just
Is it too early for me to say this is like a misadventure situation, Jamie? Do you have more?
There's a couple things I do want to do. So for all the people that are not on my bus right now, I'm going to give you all the things that you want to hear. So March of 2016, the family finally dropped the $1 million wrongful death suit. Then the Justice Department obviously ended their investigation in 2016. In August of 2016, another lawsuit was filed and quickly dismissed in January of 2017. They dismissed a case in early January 2017. Then in June of 2018, a third autopsy was done. They exhumed the body, and this concluded that there was, in fact, blunt force trauma to his chest. They then contacted the GBI and the Georgia law enforcement to tell them this, and they refused to look at the evidence and said this case is already closed. Goodbye. So the Johnsons fought and fought. They reopened this case again in 2019, and with this case opening, they grabbed a bunch of medical records, text messages, a ton of other evidence, an independent medical investigator, and basically it was stated at that time, the medical investigator stated that they could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone willfully violated his civil rights or committed any federal crime, and basically said that they could not officially give a cause of death. Again, going back to the accident. In November of 2020, the family appealed, and in March of 21, if y'all remember, this was fairly recent, the case was reopened. A lot of this happened because of a petition that was put out. 1.7 million people signed a petition, and the case was reopened, only to be quickly closed again in 2022.
Jamie, was this the situation where it was like the sheriff or somebody
Yep.
funded this? Okay, if you think I had something to do with it, I'm going to pay for it all. And
I can't remember if he funded it. Did he fund
I
it,
think I
Caroline?
don't know if he funded it, but he put out what I think
Or-
I read
or
out a
something.
reward of if any evidence that leads to this, like solving this. I think it was like a $500,000
okay, then I remember that.
money.
Yep. So and this is Carolina, if you want to talk to this, but they reopened it and it was quickly closed again in 2022 because the sheriff stated that, again, there was not enough evidence to show that anyone else was responsible for Kendrick's death. And this came about in that 16-page document that the sheriff put out. And I think you, Carolina, I think there was like 8 or 9 points, and really 6 of them. And part of this, David, you asked about an alibi. So point number 1 was the conspiracy and the cover-up, basically saying it was impossible for this one guy to get so many people behind him, essentially, right? Point number 2, we didn't talk about it yet, but there was a wrestling match that day, and Brandon, the older Bell brother, was on the wrestling team. He was supposed to be in Macon, Georgia by 4 p.m. and the bus was stated to leave at 12:30 p.m. Now there was conflicting things because Kendrick's family found a transportation log that said the bus didn't leave till 4 p.m. But turns out that was just stating the time of the event that was taking place. So it was later stated that he was on the bus. They were away from the school at the time that Kendrick was found last on the camera at 1:09. And this was proven by individuals on the bus, including the bus driver and some cell phone tower data from some people that were on the bus. Brandon also weighed in at the wrestling match, and he was in Macon, Georgia by 4 p.m. I'll put a speculation out there. Not impossible for him to have drove there on his own. Just saying. Anyways, point number 3, the cameras. They basically talked about that there was 62 cameras. They stated there was no missing evidence on it. We can go back and forth on that all day long. Coincidentally, there was supposed to be a camera on this corner of the gym where these mats were, and it was broken. Because of course it was.
Of course. Why wouldn't it be?
Yeah, with balls. And of course it's broken.
Of course. Why wouldn't it be?
But if I don't know that camera doesn't work, I'm definitely not going to commit a crime in view.
You know that it doesn't work because your dad told you it doesn't work.
Gosh.
He said that's where you can go to commit some murder.
That's so
Or hold on, or you're just a student there and you know it doesn't work.
True. Hey, I made
You
out with
go
a
to
girl
school
over
there.
here the other
Like,
day and I
you
didn't get
already
in
know
trouble.
it doesn't work. You're going to high school. There might be it's like
But doing
sometimes
things in front of a camera, not knowing if it works or not, is one thing. Murdering somebody in front of a camera, if you don't know it works or not, those are 2 different things.
But I think all of the kids in the high school know when shit fucking works or not. I think that kids in high school are like, oh, we know we can get away with this over here and that over there. And
I'm glad that's the thing that's stopping you.
that and he knows that Janelle will not be his alibi.
But besides that, though, this was the old gym, right? So you assume nothing works. No one's going to see you. Kids don't even necessarily even think of what's around them, especially if it was in the heat of the moment or something.
Actually, kids never think about what's around them.
On the camera, was it that it was broken or that it was repositioned?
I read 2 different things, and the report that you brought to me said that it was realigned, but I also
Yeah, like the
heard
one
that
from the
it
sheriff,
was,
right?
yeah, the one from the
Because
sheriff
I
said it was
wonder,
realigned.
just for speculation purposes, if it was the mats are in the corner, so if a camera is pointed to a corner and it gets realigned and it's totally the other way, the kids are going to know, everyone would know that the camera's not pointing in that
Well,
corner.
clearly the dad came earlier that day and moved the camera.
Jamie, do we know anything about the brothers later in life? Do we know anything about any history of?
I don't know about their crime history, but I do know that one of the brothers was denied his college scholarship because of this.
Really?
Wow.
That makes me, I don't think they murdered him. I know, of course, there was bad blood, but if they had nothing to do with this and that, like something that huge affected his life that way, that makes me really sad for him. Because that's also life altering.
And that was supposed to be all over a girl. Like,
which these court records state that they never, and this means nothing and something at the same time, but there was no telephone communication between Kendrick and this girl, Taylor Eakin. So they couldn't prove that there was something going on between them or not going on. But just because there's not telephone records,
yeah, it doesn't
you can talk
matter
to somebody.
Even if your boyfriend thinks your girlfriend's talking to somebody else. It doesn't like, I don't give a fuck what your phone's going to prove. And that, and to me, that doesn't prove anyone or prove anything. If you're thinking you betrayed me and you did this, but I'm sorry, these are athlete children that are somebody in their high school. They're going to talk about it with their fist and with their name calling and be done with it. And that's it, in my opinion.
And whether or not there was a situation going on with the girl, it doesn't make anything more or less valid.
Well, it gives it. They're bringing that up because it's the motive, right?
I think the motive is because KJ hit him, right? The fight turned into KJ hitting him, I believe.
Yeah, and it turned into KJ winning that, which is where all those things came, where Brandon was like, the fight isn't over, and his dad was like, why don't you come to our house and have a real fight?
So the girl, I think, was no longer the motive.
No,
If there
you're
was.
right. It'd be more like you hit,
Now it's
he hit that
he was
person.
barely-
The girl was the core of it, right? That's
Right.
what lit the flame. Even though it might have escalated into, oh, now you think you're bigger than and better than, and now we're going to fight because of that.
It's probably really jacked up her life too. I feel bad for her.
Absolutely.
well.
But do we know if they were dating, if it was girlfriend? Because I could totally see, hey, bro, I'm digging this chick, and now you talk to her in math class. If you're 17 and a hothead.
Yeah.
I don't remember if it was ever stated that. I don't think Kendrick ever dated her. I think they talked, and from what I understood is she liked him, and he was, yeah, okay, cool. But
then
like,
again, I mean, just like we just mentioned, though, that still doesn't matter, because even if she said, I'm his boyfriend and not yours, you don't own her. You know what I mean? Like, you're not property of. So it still doesn't change anything other than some egotistical pubescent boys.
This is a good time to tell our listeners that it's never worth it. Okay. Don't murder people because somebody's flirting with another one. Don't get all super, you know what? It's just not, just, you know what? I'm sorry, but just let it go. It's not
other
worth it.
fish in the sea.
The sea is not fine.
The sea is
Boiling.
Not fine. The over 40 sea is not fine.
but it's not
Stop.
worth it. It's not
Great.
worth it. Okay. Okay.
No.
Stop it.
Stop
Fight
fighting over it.
It's not worth it. Trust me. Okay. That's our PSA for today.
One little thing I want to re-mention about the cameras. I was just reading my notes and I forgot to state this. It may be a big deal. It may not be a big deal. I'm sure y'all can explain it away from me. But Brian made a very big point to say that when he was questioned, I didn't see KJ all day. I didn't see him. I didn't even know he was at school today. I don't know what happened to him. But surveillance shows Kendrick walking this far away from him in the hallway. Come on. KJ isn't a run-of-the-mill dude. You knew that was fucking him in front of you. Don't lie to me and say you didn't see him today.
But when did he say that? Did he say that while the body was still in the school?
No, he said that when he was being questioned during the investigation.
If you ask me what day I saw this person at work this week, I don't know. I just
If
one
it
of
was
the
somebody
days.
that had a very distinct look, right? Like I said, KJ wasn't your run-of-the-mill look like every
It
other
would be a
dude.
distinct look if you didn't look at him every day, but it's not
Right.
distinct if you see him every day. Police know things before other people do. We
Mhm.
need to remember that in this case. The dad of the two boys is FBI. He's going to know things before anyone else does. So when people are like, I don't remember this and I didn't do that, because your dad isn't covering up a murder. They are not covering up a crime. They are covering up a speculation to save face.
I'm also going to die on the hill that he was flushed with blackmail also, I feel.
Then this whole town is full of bad people and everybody should be talked about.
Oh my gosh.
Guys,
Guys,
this reality show.
guys, I'm only like cackling about this because Jamie loves police corruption. And every week I feel like we don't even need to ask what her take is.
It's gonna be
I'm gonna get her a shirt that says police corruption and she just can stand up and say,
I do really love police, But it's people in authority in general, because when we talked about, there was another case that we talked about where it was an electrician, and because he was an authoritative power, so it's like people in authority, I do tend to abuse their powers sometimes, and people end up dead, and it's not a coincidence.
This is going to totally sway whatever cases I pick to do later on, because I need them to be cases where you cannot take us.
But I'm gonna say it's
Police
Israel Keys. If
corruption.
you do that, I'm just gonna go, it was Israel Keys the whole time. Anything earlier than 2012 is now gonna be Israel Keys. Okay.
Carolina, was there anything else I was missing from that report? Because there's one other thing I want to talk about after that, but
I don't think so. I think you hit on all the big points of the report. He laid out like 9 things as just, I feel like the sheriff's answer to all of the pieces that have been talked about and discussed and things that the lawsuits are based on. I think that was just his response. And I think you hit on really all the big points. But it's easy to find online if anyone wants to read it.
yeah, and maybe we can put it when we release this case, we can add a link to it. Okay, so 3 more things I want to say. So number 1 is there is a Facebook page out there. So if anybody is interested, it's called Justice for Kendrick Johnson. So you can join that Facebook page. His family is very active in it. They still wholeheartedly believe that this was a homicide. If you want to support that or not support that, is out there. Also, if you do have any information about foul play in the death of KJ, you can contact the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office at 229-671-2900. And breaking news alert, in just a few days, so on September 19th of 2023, the Johnsons are expected to submit documentation regarding the Lowndes County Sheriff's investigation synopsis from 2022. We just talked about when the case was closed. Johnson's parents state that there is still false information out there about the death of their son.
But here's the thing. I think that can definitely be true. But that doesn't mean that the cover-up is of a murder. It could be just for the lack of proper investigation.
It's like Stephen Avery.
Like a long list of
Like
cases.
most of the cases that we've covered.
Yeah, exactly.
Correct. Okay, let's go around the horn, even though I probably already know that I'm on a lonely island, but it's okay. Nat, what do you believe happened with KJ?
I actually believe the first autopsy. I believe it's positional asphyxia. And the reason why I believe that is for the fact that the mats were all in the corner. It would have been very difficult, even with football players, to try to get him rolled up in a mat, get it back in the corner without anybody noticing. I think that it might have been a seriously terrible accident.
I'm next on my screen, but I'll go last because I feel like I've poisoned y'all enough. But Janelle, what do you believe?
I'm pretty similar to Nat. I think it was just an unfortunate event. I think in his mind, he thought, oh, yeah, this is totally feasible. And then you get into a situation where you can't get out of. I think the police probably did not do a super bang up job, but we talk about it all the time. There are bad cops, and then there are just bad cops where they just did not put in their 100%. They didn't. I'll agree with you. There are a lot of like super questionable things, like the clothes going missing and the morgue not paying their electric bill, and there are a lot of oddities. And I think when you add those up, it's like that inept system where we couldn't have so many more answers, but
They just weren't experienced enough, maybe.
things fell through the cracks, things yeah, I think it's one of those things where a judgment was made too quickly. And so maybe things weren't tested as much or investigated as much as they should have been. And so unfortunately, the family just has this hole. And with all the lawsuits, it's just they're desperate for anything to fill this hole. But I think it was just a tragic thing that happened.
David?
I think everybody knows my opinion at this point. I feel like it could be perceived as victim blaming, and that is definitely not what I'm doing. The point of me saying the things that I'm saying is I want the family to find peace. And I think that what's happened is you have a family that has a lot of pride in their child, and they have a hard time wrapping their mind around the child doing something that isn't the smartest or the most careful, and the repercussion was something horrible. And I mean that with all due respect.
Mhm.
I love, my support, my all goes out to this family. I want them to find that peace. And I'm definitely not blaming the victim, but I'm also not going to blaming some kids that are now victims as well.
It was an accident. That's pure and simple. I don't think anybody can be mad at you for, I hope they're not mad at you, because that's what I said too.
Cindy?
I think it was just an accident. He was thinking, I've had a 17-year-old son. They do stupid stuff. They think they're invincible. They think, oh, it's not a big deal. I'll get out, whatever. It's not a big deal. So I think he probably did that, not even really thinking it through. And if you want to throw in the murder thing, maybe people walked by and play a prank on him and just push him in farther. But even then, I feel like at this point, somebody might have come forward with that and said something, if it was a prank at least, but if it wasn't on purpose. But I don't know. I just feel like it was just a sad tragedy with it being far in the back and everything else. It would have been almost impossible for someone to intentionally murder him and put him in there, at least. That's what I think.
Carolina?
Think I am of the opinion that it probably was a terrible and heartbreaking accident that he fell in, he couldn't get out, he wasn't found, and he ended up dying. But I do think everything that has happened with the investigation and since then has made it so hard for this family to find closure. I'm going back to this photo that you had showed earlier, Jamie. Like, when was that photo taken? I feel like he must have been unrolled from that mat and rolled back up. At least that's my opinion, depending on who took that photo when that photo was taken. Because unless that was taken before they unrolled it when they found him, that doesn't make sense. And then the family has gone through trying to fight this and we talked a lot about the judges all recusing themselves from this case. There was 7 of them that recused themselves from hearing this case, that they can't even get their thoughts out there, really. So I think that I just feel for the family so much, because I think with all of that going on in an investigation that probably wasn't handled in a way that was perfect, no investigation is going to be, but I think there's a lot of flaws with this one and a lot of issues. Janelle raised a lot of those about the oddities of the case that I think this family is just going to have a very hard time finding closure.
That was said so beautifully, by the way. Misty?
I'm going to say a couple things. First, this case has always bothered me because I never quite knew where I stood on this case, and I'm still on the fence with it, to be honest with you. But I also feel like a lot of these things can all be true at once. I feel like there is a possibility that maybe these guys wanted to pick a fight with him Maybe they did pick a fight with him that day. Maybe he did get hit or something. Somebody did attack him. He got into a fight. They might have thought that they killed him. They panicked. They shoved him in the furthest thing to hide his body. I'm still there. I don't know. I feel like they might have shoved him in there and then he was stuffed in there and then that's where he vomited and then suffocated. He wasn't dead when they shoved him in there. I don't know. And I think that investigation wise, I think they jumped to a conclusion really fast and it wasn't really investigated very properly. And I think if it was, we might have had a better answer, but I think that it wasn't. So I'm all over the board on this one. I don't think that you're quite alone on your island over there, Jamie. So, hey,
Okay.
hi on this island.
Hey.
I feel I don't
Missy's
know.
on a float near it.
Yeah, I don't think
thinking
you're
about
on the
going.
island. You're just
I'm
passing
floating
by. You're on
in
a
the middle.
cruise ship.
I haven't officially said my thing yet, so you don't know what my island's about.
I know what your island's name is.
The police crypt island. I don't know. I think that there could just be a bunch, or the kids could also just be a red herring and just an unfortunate thing for them. I don't know. It just doesn't. I have a teenager. My son just turned 16. Kids are not very bright at that age, for sure. They're not. They're just not. But no part of me thinks that I'm going to give KJ all of the credit in the world right here and say that I feel like he was probably a really bright kid. And I just don't, my brain doesn't connect I'm going to dive into this mat and grab my shoe at the bottom. I just don't see it. I can reach under the mat. I can knock the mat over. I don't see diving in to grab a shoe. It just doesn't make sense to me. Although, again, like Cindy said, teenagers do not do things that make any sense. They're not the brightest. Our brains are not fully developed until we're 25. Sure. But I don't know. It just doesn't make sense. Why would you dive into a mat to retrieve a shoe? It just doesn't make sense to me. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think I answered your question, but I'm saying.
That was the best non-answer.
Thank you. Teenagers are not bright. However, I feel like he might have had more shit together from what I understand about him as a person than to know to dive into a mat to retrieve the shoe.
There was a TikTok video of a probably 14 to 16-year-old girl that had to have the fire department come because she was trying to get into a baby swing and got stuck.
Yeah, I've seen that. Okay.
And she was so stuck, they had to cut her down, cut it off. So kids will do things that they think sounds cool or fun or whatever, not thinking of the repercussions of it.
Dana, what do you think?
This was horrible and tragic and awful accident. Now, if we wanted to go down the path of discussing the theory, the conspiracy, whatever you want to say, the possibility that the school should be held to more, I don't know if negligence is the right word, I would totally be on board with that. I think schools in general have the expectation to help keep your kids safe in some way. And, we're only going to have the cameras on if they detect motion. In cases like this, it didn't keep a kid safe. Or unrolling, let's go with the theory that they did unroll a mat to see, or they did unroll to see what was going on or who was in there. What do you do? And I think in any industry, the standard is let's do damage control now. So hopefully it can reduce what comes back to us later. And not saying that did happen, but I could totally be convinced that did happen. The school saying we need to save our behinds because we had the expectation to keep this child safe, and he died and he was found on our premises. And I'm sorry, but the whole we will dictate what of the footage does get released, I do not like that one bit. If you're a public school, especially with your being funded, let's say by your local community and taxpayers, I'm sorry, you should not be allowed to say, okay, how about 10 minutes over here, 10 minutes over there? Because again, you are not keeping your students safe if that is the precedent being safe of, oh no, don't worry, parents, we'll let you see what we want you to see. So personally, I don't care for that much.
Dana, do you think that the school then knows more than what they have released? Do you think that the people who have watched the video?
I don't know, just because it goes to what I was saying earlier about the more people that get involved with something, it's harder to keep everybody on the same page. And okay, we all know our stories. Nobody's going to say anything to anyone, right? So if there was this grand conspiracy of 3 football players and the girl and the school covering it up, let's just even stop there. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the best answer to your question, Missy,
and it's a lot of young people.
And it's been 10 years since 2013, so hopefully these young people have grown. If there was a girl that lured him to the gym, being, oh god, my conscience is getting the best of, if that was the case, I could totally, I really feel for the parents is where I'm going with this. And I can see them saying, I want answers, and we're going to go through the goddamn courts. And if I have to, I'm going to just keep suing until I get an answer that I'm satisfied with. I could personally see that a route to go down, because in my opinion, I feel like they're experiencing the same kind of thing that we are, that I don't know what happened. I don't like what happened. And I feel like somebody knows something that I don't, and I want those answers.
Yeah.
Whether it's for us saying it was probably an accident with a lot of weird coincidences, or the family feeling like there's no way there could be an accident with this many coincidences.
Dana, I want to ask you what you were meaning. You were talking about the family going after negligence. Isn't there a difference in negligence of a deceased body versus negligence of a live body? Or am I thinking of different things?
So I would think of it more as in like all buildings are checked.
They had lockers, but you had to pay for the lockers in a school that was maybe not as, I don't know, rich as other schools in the area. Right there, you're creating a problem. Did the school know that their students were just stashing
They
Yeah.
did.
their stuff in these
They were
areas?
aware of it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Because then that to me means, okay, so you're aware that children are hiding their shoes in 200-pound
Yep.
mats.
And climbing on them. Like it
And
was
climbing
common
on
for them
them.
to climb on them and sit on them. Right? I could definitely get down with the negligence vibe. And it's hard for me to believe that this school that just built this brand new gym was that hard on its luck.
What doesn't settle well with me is people are like, they're a poor school, and so they're charging for lockers. The most elite schools also charge for lockers. That's how they make their money.
And then right after this happens, though, David, they stopped charging for lockers.
When things are brought to people's, when it's brought to the surface,
yeah, you're quick to make changes.
Easy fix. This is an easy fix.
I am obviously in the camp of Missy more so than others, but I want to explain. I do like her. I'm on the fence. I struggle. I find it really hard to believe that somebody would dive down a mat like that and die tragically like that. I do agree with all of you that I feel just awful for the parents, and I do feel like they're grasping for any sense of helping this be right in their head. But I also think there's just so much that's wrong and points to, called if you will, a conspiracy, that it could have been a murder cover up. To Missy's point earlier, why can't it be both? Why can't it be that he did go in the gym and they were pissed off at him and they did have a fight with him, and maybe they didn't mean to murder him, but they did, and they stuck him in the mat and he was still alive, and that's why there's vomit in the mat, right? And I know we talk about, will it be impossible for all of those people to keep a secret and it's a 1 in a million chance? It's also a 1 in a million chance that a kid goes down a mat and dies just as easily, in my opinion anyways, that it could be that this tragic accident happened. It could be that this 1 in a million chance that everything aligns perfectly and this quote unquote cover up. I don't think it's as big as a cover up as what maybe they want you to believe it is, but I think if there is some murder, there is some cover up, and I think there's truth and lies all the time. I don't know. I do lean in the camp of I do think he was murdered. I do also believe that he was alive when he was put in that mat. He had to be if there was vomit found in there. That part really sticks with me.
I think had there not been this 2021 situation where everything was, let's start from scratch, let's look at everything again, we're going to offer this insane amount of money as a reward. Had that not happened, I probably wouldn't have stayed on your bus, but I might have made some stops with you on the bus. But with that so recently happening, and it was crickets.
But if you, let's say somebody offers money, but you're an accessory to murder, you're not going to admit that you're doing, that you were there. You might not be responsible, but you were there when it happened, and then you're an accessory to murder. You know what I mean? You're not going to sit there and admit that for some money, because you're not going to get the money anyway. You're going to get charged.
It's blackmail. It's not money necessarily. I have this over you. I don't have to pay you anything, because the minute you talk, you're fucked anyways. I appreciate y'all taking the time to chat with me. I appreciate y'all giving some love to KJ's family, and we'll wait to see what happens here in a couple of days when they bring these documents to light. Till then, all we can do is speculate wildly. We don't want you to miss any of our future recordings. Please take this time now to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can find us also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok at SWACPod. That's SWACPOD. Or you can contact us via email for any questions, comments, or case ideas at swacpod@gmail.com. Thank you for speculating wildly with us tonight.